For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to speak out of order for the purpose of inquiring to the Majority Leader the schedule for next week.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, also asked to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
With that, I want to now yield to the Majority Leader, my friend from Maryland, to talk about the schedule for next week, and I yield.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Pending Senate passage of the CR tonight, without amendment, the House will not be in session tomorrow. I want to reiterate, pending passage of the CR tonight. If the CR is not passed, we will be in session tomorrow at 9 o'clock. If the Senate fails to act, as I just said, we will meet at 9 a.m. for legislative business and is expected to vote on some of the postponed suspensions. Members are encouraged to keep their schedules flexible as we work to fully fund government and prevent a shutdown at 12 midnight tomorrow night. Next week, on Monday, pending Senate action on full government funding and H.R. 6119, further extending Government Act, being signed into law, the House is no longer expected to meet. This is a change from our previously announced schedule. We will not be in session Monday, assuming we have funded the government. On Tuesday, the House will meet at 12 p.m. for morning hour and 2 p.m. for legislative business. On Wednesday and Thursday, the House will meet at 10 a.m. for morning hour and 12 p.m. for legislative business. On Friday, the House will meet at 9 a.m. for legislative business, as was previously scheduled. The House will consider several bills under suspension of the rules. The complete list of suspension bills will be announced by the close of business tomorrow. Additionally, the House will pass H.R. 4350, the National Defense Authorization Act. Again, a second time, to provide our troops with the pay they deserve and our military with the tools it needs to carry out its missions and safely and effectively and keep America safe and keep the peace. Again, I would reiterate that is the second time we'll pass. This version, as I understand it, will be the conference-agreed version of the defense bill. This has been a discussion between the House and the Senate. The House will also consider H.R. 8363, the Protecting Our Democracy Act, to reassert Congress's role as a co-equal branch of government by addressing the vulnerabilities exploited by the former president and his enablers to weaken our democracy, undermine the rule of law, and subvert the systems of checks and balances enshrined by the framers in our Constitution. The House may also consider legislation to address the debt limit and prevent a manufactured economic catastrophe that would derail our recovery from the pandemic and cause needless suffering to millions of American families. I would reiterate that while we don't know the exact date at which America will be unable to pay its bills, we will address this next week, hopefully in a bipartisan fashion. Moreover, the House will be ready to act on H.R. 5376, the Build Back Better Act, should the Senate amend it and send it back to the House. Lastly, of course, additional legislative items are possible. And I will yield back to the distinguished gentleman from Louisiana.
Thank the gentleman for that update. As it relates to tomorrow's schedule, as the gentleman from Maryland said, could be fluid depending on how the CR is processed in the Senate. If the CR does not pass the Senate tonight, are there bills that are specifically designated to come up tomorrow, or is that a to-be-determined issue?
We have a list of suspension bills which has been announced, has been on our calendar for consideration. Those would be the pieces of legislation with which we would deal pending action by the Senate.
Thank the gentleman. As it relates to the debt ceiling, and we had a discussion a few weeks ago relating to the debt ceiling, would there be a bipartisan negotiation? We haven't had that so far. Is there an anticipation that there would be a plan to try to engage both sides in a negotiation on the debt ceiling, or is this something that we're just going to have to wait to see next week?
Well, I think we'll probably have to wait and see exactly what's going to happen. As the gentleman knows, we have passed a debt limit twice through this House. There has been a problem in the Senate, and I would expect Senator Schumer and Senator McConnell will be discussing that in the next few days. Senator McConnell has made it very clear that he thinks that failing to protect the full faith and credit of the United States of America would have dire adverse consequences. So he's made it very clear he thinks we ought not to do that. Senator Schumer has done the same. Essentially, my answer to the gentleman is we've passed it twice in one form or another, so we can pass it and will pass it once the Senate agrees on a version. So the two leaders are discussing that, I'm sure. Now, I haven't talked to either one of them, but that's my premise.
Well, then we'll see what develops from that discussion. As it relates to the National Defense Authorization Act, and as the gentleman pointed out, we're aware there are bipartisan negotiations between both the House and Senate, Republicans and Democrats. I share the hope and expectation that they can come to an agreement. There are a few final details that both sides are trying to work out. They've already agreed, which we both share, that our troops deserve a pay raise, need a pay raise, and that number has been agreed to. Hopefully that is part of this, as well as the proper funding levels for our nation's defense as we see threats emerging throughout the world. And we also know the detriment of not having proper defense funding because they can't enter into the contracts that are necessary. So hopefully those conversations seem to be, from what we're hearing, both going well. Hopefully that is a bill that can come to the floor next week, and we can all come together to help pass that. I'd yield if the gentleman had anything else.
I thank the gentleman. I agree with his comments. It is my understanding, although I haven't talked personally, but it's my understanding that introducing the conference-agreed bill in the House and passing it through the House will, under Senate procedures, facilitate them resolving this issue, hopefully in a positive way, next week.
Thanks. There's two specific pieces of legislation I'd like to ask the gentleman to look at. One is, by the end of the year, as you know, there are some potential cuts coming to entities like Medicare if Congress doesn't take action. There's a bipartisan bill that members of the Doctors Caucus, other members of Energy and Commerce, and other committees of jurisdiction have worked on. It's H.R. 6020, that would stave off those cuts to our health care providers. It would need to be passed by the end of the year. Otherwise, those cuts would automatically kick in. If the gentleman could take a look at that bill and see if that's something we could do in a bipartisan way before we leave for the year. Another would be, and you and I have had this conversation successfully on other legislation dealing with ALS. And Steve Gleason, the Steve Gleason Act was one of those. There's others. I've spoken to Steve Gleason recently. There's a piece of legislation that we were able to work on that got out of the Energy and Commerce Committee unanimously. It's H.R. 3537, the Accelerating Access to Critical Therapies for ALS Act. And I would just ask if the gentleman could look at that bill. It's a bill that came out unanimously, bipartisan, from the Energy and Commerce Committee, and something obviously would help a lot of people who could use that help. And I'd yield.
I agree with the gentleman. We've talked to the sponsor. We've talked to others. And I expect this bill to be on the floor next week.
Well, that would be great news to so many people across this country.
The gentleman will yield. With respect to the issues that I think we have broad agreement on, and that is the cliffs that were created on Medicare and sequester are not good policy, and we ought to act on those. And we are very seized of that issue, and hopefully we can resolve something next week. The gentleman mentions about doing it in a bipartisan fashion. The good news is, and I know the gentleman will agree, that earlier this year, we delayed to January 1st of this coming year these items, particularly the 2% sequester, by a vote of 90-2 in the Senate, meaning only 2 people voting against it. And in the House, 384, we were unanimous on our side, but you had the overwhelming majority on your side as well. So 384-38, we extended that. And I'm hopeful that we'll do that again in a bipartisan way, because not to do so, I think, would be very harmful to the medical community and to the country, and obviously to patients that are served by the medical community. So I'm hopeful that we can resolve that as early as next week.
Well, I share that sentiment the gentleman had, and hopefully we can achieve those bipartisan victories. And as you mentioned, H.R. 3537, that would be a tremendous victory for people that struggle with ALS to continue to seek out new therapies and be able to live their lives in the best way possible. And I appreciate the gentleman's past efforts as well as the offer to bring that bill to the floor next week. With that, I would yield back if the gentleman doesn't have anything else.
I thank the gentleman, and I'll yield back.
Thank the gentleman. I yield back. Balance my time. The nation is facing at our southern border. And this has been a crisis that's been brewing for months. It's not an overnight problem, but it is an executive order created problem when President Biden, on day one, got rid of some policies that were working incredibly well. And every Border Patrol agent that I've talked to, and I was on the border last week, Thursday and Friday in McAllen, Texas, went to Donna, Texas at the Donna processing facility. Every border agent says the same thing. They said, getting rid of the Remain in Mexico policy, that one action alone opened up the floodgates to a surge. Thousands of people a day crossing our border illegal. Then you couple that with the deterioration of the Northern Triangle agreements where, and yes, it was President Trump who negotiated those agreements with Mexico, with Honduras, with El Salvador, with Guatemala. And maybe if President Biden just doesn't like the fact that President Trump did something that was working well, why doesn't he renegotiate those agreements and call them his own? But they were working. And now today, it's so out of control that we have, for example, at the Donna processing facility designed for about 250 person capacity. When I was visiting that facility last Friday, it was over 4,000 people. Young kids primarily crammed into that facility in those holding cells like sardines. In fact, yesterday we had a committee hearing with Dr. Fauci and CDC Director Walensky. And I asked them specifically about what's going on down at our southern border, showed them some of the pictures that have been taken. And if you look at the CDC guidance that's out there on how we as American citizens have to conduct ourselves. If you own a restaurant, for example, whether it's in Baltimore, New Orleans, or anywhere else, if there's a capacity limit, and if that limit was 250 people, if there were 4,000 people in that restaurant, it would be shut down today. And I asked both Dr. Fauci and Dr. Walensky, would that facility be in violation of CDC guidance? And both of them said yes in testimony under oath. And then I talked to them about what's happening at our southern border. And I asked them, are these conditions in compliance with CDC guidance? Both Dr. Fauci and Dr. Walensky said, no, this is not. We talked about the Donna detention facility and the inhumane treatment of these young children by the Biden administration in that facility. And I asked Dr. Fauci, is that facility's conditions in which they're treating those young kids by the Biden administration in compliance with CDC guidance? And Dr. Fauci said no. And Dr. Walensky, the CDC director, testified the same exact way that no, those are not in compliance. And in fact, as we know, they're coming across from Mexico. Do you know that the CDC guidance designates Mexico as the most dangerous nation right now, along with probably a few others, but they are the most dangerous in terms of COVID transmission. And so CDC guidance encourages American citizens not to go to Mexico, but they say if you do come back from Mexico, you are mandated by the CDC to show a COVID negative test before you as an American citizen can come back into the United States. Do you know that not one of these people are being tested for COVID when they come in illegally across the Rio Grande from Mexico? And then many of them are being put on airplanes without ID, being paid for free, most by the taxpayers, put on airplanes to fly off into cities all across the country. Border Patrol agents have told us at least 15% of these people that crossed illegally are COVID positive. And so I asked Dr. Walensky and I asked Dr. Fauci, does that process by the Biden administration violate CDC guidance on travel from Mexico? And they both testified that yes, in fact, it does. That if they're getting on an airplane, they should be tested negative for COVID. None of them are, and in fact, some of them are known to be COVID positive, being put on airplanes, flying to cities all across this country. It's going on right now. That was going on Friday. About half the plane that I was on when I flew from McAllen back home had people with folders that said, "I do not speak English," and it had a city on it. And it was in multiple cities. But this is what the Biden administration is doing in violation of CDC guidance that you and I have to follow, that our constituents who are seeing their livelihoods crushed, their restaurants being closed down, many that won't open again forever, because they have to play by the rules that CDC and their states issue, and yet the Biden administration is exempting themselves from this. Now, we have legislation I'd like to bring up to the majority leader that would fix this. And my colleague, Ms. Miller-Meeks, requires a COVID test before someone's released from CBP custody. Ms. Harrell prohibits DHS from ceasing Title 42. There's a bipartisan bill by Mr. Katko and Mr. Quellar, which establishes an irregular migration surge border response fund. I would like to ask the gentleman if he would bring those bills to the floor to address this crisis at the border. That's not only a humanitarian crisis, a national security crisis, but it's a Biden-created crisis that's violating the very CDC guidance, according to Dr. Fauci, that American citizens have to follow. And I would yield to the gentleman.
We have a situation that is heart-wrenching and unacceptable, and it must be dealt with. In part, this situation comes because of the draconian policies of the previous administration. It comes also because Republicans have refused in both houses to come to agreement on a comprehensive immigration reform bill. So we have chaos as a result, because our immigration system, as I believe almost every member of your side of the aisle and every member of my side of the aisle, Madam Speaker, believes is broken. Now, unfortunately, what we see in that picture is broken systems causing great danger, apprehension, and fear among many people who are fleeing to America for refuge. As, of course, Lady Liberty at the head of the harbor at the Hudson River raises her torch and says that's what America is for. Now, having said that, this situation is unacceptable. It's unacceptable for humanitarian reasons. It's unacceptable for the safety of not only those people that are in that picture, but for American citizens as well. Now, it is my understanding, Madam Speaker, that CDC's existing pandemic public health order for closed borders is in fact being followed. In Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California. Unaccompanied children crossing the border are tested by the Department of Health and Human Services. Migrants entering ICE facilities are tested, and they are quarantined if they test positive. So protections are trying to be effected, and this administration is working very hard to ensure the safety of Americans and the safety of these many children who have come across the border. None of them have been taken out of the arms of their parents. None of them have been made orphans by this administration. I didn't hear the gentleman lamenting the fact that we had hundreds of children who had been taken out of the arms of their parents and then they could not be found. That is, their parents. They could not be reunited with their parents. This is a challenge. It's not a partisan challenge. It's a challenge for America. It's a challenge for us all. And this administration is working to try to come to a solution that is both humanitarian and effective. I am hopeful that they will proceed in accomplishing that objective. And the gentleman mentions the policies of the Trump administration, which substantially underfunded its own policies of trying to help the Triangle countries. And when I say help the Triangle countries, unfortunately, the leadership of those countries, in too many instances, is not trying to help itself. And so we see panicked people fleeing. I don't know how many members, and Madam Speaker, I don't know whether the gentleman from Louisiana, my friend, Mr. Scalise, saw the pictures of 2 children being dropped over the fence. Over the fence, by the way, that very large fence, billions of dollars of fence. Smugglers dropped 2 children over the fence. That's how secure it was. And the tragedy of those children being dropped over that fence alone. I don't care where they're from or who they are, but my faith teaches me that they may be strangers, but they are brothers and sisters. And in that context, we need to come to grips, and I'm hopeful that the gentleman will support the administration's desire to get a comprehensive immigration bill adopted in this Congress. In 2013, the Senate passed, Madam Speaker, a bill which was supported by Democrats and Republicans, 14 Republican members of the United States Senate here, and we pleaded with the Republican leadership to bring that bill to the floor. Now, they will say they brought a bill to the floor. They did draw a bill to the floor, and almost nobody thought it was effective in accomplishing the objective of having an immigration system that would work. So I tell the gentleman, the pictures that he is displaying ought to concern us all deeply. And we ought to urge all of us to cooperate and work towards making sure that we don't have scenes like that and that we have the ability to deal with it, this surge at the border, in a humane way. But no one in the previous administration can wash their hands of the responsibility of creating a situation which, yes, the gentleman says Mexico is judged to be one of the most dangerous nations on earth for COVID-19. And the previous administration said to people trying to seek solace and health and safety, stay in the most dangerous nation on earth from COVID-19. I don't know whether that's a very humane policy. That's not a sanctuary for people who are in dire straits. We said no to some people who came here from Germany. We said, no, you can't come in. And many of them returned in the 30s and early 40s and were slaughtered. They came here for sanctuary and found none. That doesn't mean we can take everybody, but it does mean that we need to deal with it in a humanitarian way, in a way that honors our values and honors these people as our fellow human beings. So I tell the gentleman in conclusion that these are sad scenes, and we need to respond to them in a humanitarian way, but also a smart way. And we need to respond as well to the cause as well as the effect. And I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. As we talk about asylum, let's be clear. America has laws for how someone can seek asylum. I haven't seen anybody suggest that those laws just be repealed and you just take somebody's word if they say they want to come to America to seek asylum, come in today and jump ahead of everyone else.
Will the gentleman,
I'll
the gentleman
give the gentleman
just for one question on the asylum issue?
Yes, sure.
Does the gentleman believe we ought to obey America's laws on asylum?
I think we ought to obey America's laws on immigration across the board. And if you look at the asylum laws, there is a process to seek asylum. And in fact, every year people are granted that asylum if they prove their case. And that's where the law comes into play, which is being ignored right here. So what President Trump did when there was a surge in 2019, he confronted it, as a leader should do. He talked to people on the ground. He talked to our Border Patrol agents, who are the ones who have to deal with this crisis on a daily basis. In fact, 40% of our Border Patrol agents tonight at midnight, like Thursday night at midnight last week, where I was with those Border Patrol agents, 40% of them are pulled off of guarding our border, where their primary mission is to stop drug cartels from smuggling fentanyl, cocaine, heroin into our country, which they're doing now at much higher levels, killing Americans all across the country. 40% of them pulled away because they're going to be changing diapers in this detention facility tonight, because that's what they're being tasked to do by the Biden administration. That's not their job. It's not why they signed up. Their morale is incredibly low. And well over roughly 90% of people who say they're coming here to seek asylum, those cases are rejected by the courts. Rejected. And in fact, it's kind of hard to make an asylum claim when the parents of many of these kids you're seeing here paid thousands of dollars to the drug cartels to smuggle their kids and themselves into the United States. Hard to claim economic asylum, which is the case many of them plead, when you paid $4,000 to try to come here illegally, when there's a legal process to come here. Not just the normal legal process where you can wait to come into America legally, where we let 1 million people into our country every year, the most generous nation in the world, America. But when they go around that system, that's where it overwhelms our system. And that's what's going on right now. President Trump confronted it, not by saying no one can come in, but by saying, you have to follow our laws if you want to come here. If you want to seek asylum, you've got to request it like everyone else. And they allowed them to even come through South and Central American countries, but stay in Mexico. And Mexico actually agreed with this, and there was an orderly system. And you got to hear your claim in a very expedient way. Today, they're given a piece of paper when they come across the border illegally, saying, come show up maybe 5 years from now. Good luck with that. And then they're given a plane ticket, a free plane ticket without an ID, to be sent off to some other state. I saw manila envelopes. Once you got below the I do not speak English, it said Dallas was on one, Philadelphia was on one, New Jersey was on one. I don't know what's going to happen to them when they land in New Jersey. If they can't speak English, if these kids, or what school system are they going to be placed in? Who's then going to be responsible for this breakdown at our southern border, which was created by President Biden, which he could fix today? I've urged President Biden to go down to the border and see this for himself, to see how inhumane he's treating kids in violation of his own CDC guidance, which Dr. Fauci yesterday verified. That's, if you read the child abuse and neglect laws of the state of Texas, where this facility is, this is a violation of the child abuse and neglect laws at the President Biden-run facility. And again, President Trump went and negotiated with Mexico, went and negotiated with those Northern Triangle countries to resolve the surge. This could be resolved as well, and you don't need to reinvent the wheel, because there was a method for how to resolve it legally, using the legal system that America has. Sure, I would agree it needs reforms, not an amnesty reform, where you send a magnet not only across South and Central America, but around the world, that America's borders are open, because that's the message today. As the gentleman knows, there are at least 6 people on the terrorist watch list that have come across America's southern border. And I'm not talking about from South and Central American countries, from Middle Eastern countries, from Eastern European countries. Those are just the ones we know of that we've caught. And the Biden administration won't share that data with the media. The Biden administration won't even let the press into this facility, which is a national disgrace. I could imagine what the press would have said if the Trump administration was housing kids in a 33-person facility. There's over 400 crammed into a 33-person cell in the middle of a pandemic. And again, Dr. Fauci said this violates every protocol there is when we're trying to get our economy reopened. Other countries have to control COVID too, but in America we're trying to control it. But here's where the double standard and hypocrisy is driving people nuts. If any American citizen ran their business in America like this, they'd be shut down by the federal government today. But yet people can come here illegally, and the Biden administration is running this facility in violation of those very same guidances. And you know what happens to them? They're given a free airplane ticket, put on an airplane, possibly with COVID, and sent into some interior country of America, and we don't even know where they're going. The Biden administration won't share that. We've asked for a meeting, by the way. Our leadership team, Leader McCarthy, myself, have asked for a meeting with President Biden to talk about this crisis, and he refuses to meet with us about it. Just ignoring a problem will not make it go away. If we're going to find a solution to this, and again, I listed a number of bills, including some that are bipartisan, that would start solving this problem. But President Biden doesn't even want to go down. He put Vice President Harris in charge of this mess, and she won't even go down to the border. Maybe because she doesn't want to be associated with President Biden's debacle. But she was put in charge of it. She is the Vice President of the United States. She has a responsibility to go down there. She should have gone down there weeks ago, but she still hasn't been. And maybe if they saw that, if they looked into the eyes of these young kids, one of the first girls we ran into might have been a 10-year-old girl in one of these cells, and she was crying. And we asked her, "Why are you crying?" And she said, "I don't want to be here." She's an orphan. The gentleman talked about orphans. All of these kids, there are no parents with them. They don't want to be here. Many were crying because they're jammed into these cells for 20 hours a day, at least 15% with COVID, 6 inches apart, not 6 feet apart. That's what the Biden administration is doing right now. President Trump fixed this problem. And again, if President Biden just doesn't like President Trump, call it his own name. We don't care the template. If he doesn't want to do what actually worked, then do something else that works. But just doing this, it's not only a national disgrace. Dr. Fauci and Dr. Walensky yesterday said it's a violation of the CDC protocols that every American taxpayer has to follow, and they don't. Exempting themselves from a problem, but making everybody else comply with it is no way to instill confidence in the American people. And I hope the president goes down there. I hope the president resolves this issue. He should meet with us. He said he wanted to unify the country. He said he wanted to work with everybody. It's time he start following through on those promises. And I would yield.
Donald Trump didn't fix the problem. He delayed the problem. That's what happened. That's what those pictures reflect. He didn't fix the problem. He would say to those kids, "Get out of here. Go back to Mexico. Maybe you have a parent there. Maybe you have somebody who'll take care of you. But get out of here." That was one way to, quote, solve the problem, I presume. But those kids didn't go away. The fear that they have for being home didn't go away. Now, I have said, Madam Speaker, this is something that we all need to deal with from a compassionate standpoint and from a legal standpoint and from a human standpoint, which I guess is redundant to compassionate. But the fact of the matter is that President Trump did not solve this problem. He simply delayed it. And when he left, the pressure was so great because they did not believe that this president would simply throw them to the wolves, take them from their parents, treat them as refuse. So we need to deal with this, and hopefully we will. Hopefully we'll get comprehensive immigration reform. I would say again that one of the reasons that we have the problem of not adjudicating these people quickly is because we don't have enough judges. And the reason we don't have enough judges, which were included both in the 2013 bill and subsequent reform bills, is because we haven't passed bills to provide the judges. On the theory that if you don't provide the judges, you won't be able to approve asylum and people won't be able to get in. I'm, Madam Speaker, at the end of this circuitous argument, and I yield back.
Well, thank the gentleman for yielding. These are children being thrown to the wolves, and it's not President Trump who's doing it. I know just yesterday, one of the members of the House Democrat leadership team, Chairman Nadler, introduced a bill to pack the Supreme Court. This is a proposal that we've seen in other countries. Unfortunately, it's mostly socialist countries. If you look at some of the examples, in 2004, a Venezuela dictator, Hugo Chavez, packed his court, and the result was totalitarian dominance for his socialist regime. Congressman Jimenez, who himself fled Cuba, fled a communist regime, said just recently on court packing, quote, "Packing the court is a tactic used by brutal dictatorships to consolidate the socialist power, which resulted in tens of thousands of court rulings in its favor, basically destroying the country, closed quote. I wanted to ask the gentleman, is that court-packing bill a bill that the majority is going to be bringing to the floor or even marking up in committee? And I would yield.
Well, I have not had a discussion with Mr. Nadler, but as the gentleman knows, we have a lot of work to do on the floor of the House of Representatives, and we intend to get that work done. We have not considered bringing to the floor the bill to which the gentleman refers. Did the gentleman in his research find any instances in any authoritarian country where they refused to consider a constitutional appointee to their Supreme Court that the president, with 10 months on his term, sent down to the United States Senate or some other body in those bodies?
If the gentleman yield back, I haven't read the Constitution of Venezuela, but I know in the Constitution of the United States, it actually gives the Senate the advise and consent role, responsibility, as it relates to Supreme Court picks, and obviously that has been kept. We've seen from the Borking
Did the gentleman find
past, and I'll yield for a moment, but you surely have seen in years past, and the Borking incident was probably the most embarrassing egregious abuse that started this back and forth where individual Supreme Court picks became more personally scrutinized, and that process has been abused in cases like Bork. Even the Kavanaugh hearing got so out of control where disgraceful false allegations were made. But in the end, the Senate's advise and consent role is part of the United States Constitution. I don't know if the gentleman's suggesting that should be changed. I don't see it. Even with a Democrat majority right now, I wouldn't suggest changing that process that's in our Constitution.
But the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
I don't know about the bill that Mr. Nadler points out, but I do know, Madam Speaker, that the Constitution says nothing about the Senate's ability to simply to refuse to consider a appointee of the President of the United States. And I don't think the founders had any concept that that would be the case when they gave the power of appointment to the President of the United States. And then, when that occurred, when the present Attorney General was appointed to the Supreme Court, Mitch McConnell said, we're not going to consider it. 10 months before the end of the term of a President of the United States. And then they said, the reason being is because we have an election coming up in just a few months. In that case, it was 8 months. In just a few months, and the next president ought to appoint. That deep principle enunciated by Mr. McConnell, by Mr. Graham, and others, who's now was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, that deep principle was abandoned immediately when it became politically pragmatic for the Republican Party to do so and steal a Supreme Court justice. So he can talk about socialism all he wants. What a distraction that is. A failure to want to discuss on the merits the issues. And so what do? They talk about, Madam Speaker, socialism or communism or dictatorship. None of which we have in the United States of America. Now, we just lost a president of the United States that, in my experience, and I've served with many presidents of the United States, was the most authoritarian-seeking president with whom I've served. So I tell my friend, Madam Speaker, that we're going to focus on issues important to the American people. We want to pass a jobs bill to make sure that America is competitive in the 21st century. We want to pass a jobs bill to make sure that families have good jobs, good paying, that they can support themselves and their families. We want to support bills that build America back better. I want to build an America that makes sure that everybody can make it in America. Not only manufacture it in America, but make it in America. That's what we're going to be focused on. And we hope that the debate is on the merits of those proposals, not some aspersion of some ideological tinge that they may think their supporters regale at. So, Madam Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back. And this is the bill. It's only a page and not even 2 pages, not even a page and a half, but the real change in law by the member of House Democrat leadership, Chairman Nadler, says, quote, a Chief Justice of the United States and 12 Associate Justices, any 8 of whom shall constitute a quorum. So in essence, a hostile takeover of the United States Supreme Court, not going through the traditional process that's been in place for over 100 years. And I think the gentleman knows, if you go back historically, the president in power when the Senate was held by a different party, was led by a different party. I can't recall a case in generations where if in the election year there was a vacancy in the Supreme Court, it was filled. And everybody in the country knew that that was an issue in the election of 2016. In fact, it was probably one of the deciding issues that helped elect President Trump, was that there was that vacancy and the public wanted to be engaged in the direction of the country as well as the direction of the court. It was absolutely a debated, heavily debated item in the 2016 presidential election, and President Trump won that election. But again, I've never heard anybody suggesting changing the Constitution to take away the Senate's advise and consent rule, but we do see here a bill that was filed just this week by a leader in the Democrat Party to have a hostile takeover of the Supreme Court, similar to what's been done in socialist countries. And I think it's important to point out who's proposed those kind of changes in the past and what it's led to. And I know President Biden himself is on record many times criticizing heavily the idea of packing the Supreme Court. Now, that was before he was president. Now that it would be him that would be able to appoint these extra judges, I don't know if his position's changed, but it's dangerous precedent. It's the kind of precedent that exists in Soviet-style nations. I sure hope it's not here, but Mr. Nadler did just say yesterday, when asked about Speaker Pelosi's position, he said, quote, Speaker Pelosi and others will come along. So I was just wondering if that was something that the gentleman was planning on bringing to the floor. That would be a divisive issue as opposed to things that we could work together, like infrastructure, that would be unifying. And obviously there's a lot of talk about infrastructure. This is something that there's tremendous interest on both sides of the aisle. I know Chairman DeFazio, as well as the ranking member Sam Graves, have had a lot of conversations about things that we could agree on. And I would hope that would be the approach that we take, unlike the bill that over 90% of which had nothing to do with COVID, the $1.9 trillion spending bill, which was hyper-partisan. I hope we approach this in a bipartisan way because, as I've said, there are clearly members on both sides that want to agree on an infrastructure bill and have lots of areas of agreement if we're talking about infrastructure. And by infrastructure, I think most Americans, if you asked them what they thought was infrastructure, I would say roads, bridges, ports, waterways, broadband. Once you get into social policy and Green New Deal type policies or tax hikes that would make America the highest rate above communist China in terms of tax policy. National Association of Manufacturers said that the kind of proposal that's being floated in the partisan approach would kill over 1 million American jobs. And so I appreciate the gentleman from Maryland talked about jobs. Why would we want to approach this in such a partisan way that we would threaten millions of jobs, that we would make America uncompetitive again, and communist China would have a lower tax rate than America? Hopefully we do the bipartisan approach, not the partisan approach. And I would yield to the gentleman to enlighten us on what direction is being approached right now.
The gentleman refers to communist China, apparently wants to follow that example. A communist authoritarian government that owns most of the manufacturing capability in China. Not all of it. Ironic in 2 different debates in less than 5 minutes that the gentleman would point to China as the example of what perhaps we ought to do when their tax policy is approximately 100%, except what they want to allow their citizens to have. Let me just close on that point with the Supreme Court, Madam Speaker, has been packed. I yield.